Welcome to Mass Culture's MC Minds, where we delve deeper into the intelligence of Canadian thought leaders in the arts. My name is Catherine Geertsema. Today, Mass Culture Operations Group member Tara Mazurk, Senior Consultant at Global Public Affairs, interviews Senator Patricia Bovey of Manitoba, and they discuss the Massey Commission as inspired by Mass Culture's digital gathering released on October 17, 2019.
Thank you so much, Senator Bovey, for joining us today. This is a follow-up conversation on 70 years later, contemporary perspectives on the Massey Commission, and we're just going to talk about cultural policy history and information today. Before I do, we both want to offer a land acknowledgement. I myself am Tara. I am a board member and co-founder of Mass Culture, and I live and work in Ottawa. And I recognize that Ottawa is the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. Ottawa and every city, town, and community in which each of you reside is still home to Indigenous people. We acknowledge the reach of our work today extends beyond to other Indigenous territories. And I personally have a deep reverence and respect for the land and the planet that I walk on. And while today we're going to be exploring cultural policy information, frameworks, and history historically from a settler perspective, I hope that as we move forward, cultural policy information can be expansive and really honor the many footprints that walk along many paths. So thank you for Mother Earth and the resources that we are using. And we honor all of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have been living on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful and have much more to learn and to move on together. Senator Bovey?
Well, I would like to add to what you've just said. As a senator from Manitoba and one who lives in Winnipeg, I would like to acknowledge that I come from Treaty 1 territory. And the land of Treaty 1 is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and it's also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I would like to say in my years of working in the cultural sector, I have worked with all those peoples as well as First Nations peoples from treaty lands and territories across this country.
Thank you so much, Senator. So to dive right in, I think first of all, we're curious about yourself, your pathway to the Senate, and your interest and work in cultural policy. Could you give a little bit of information about who you are?
Well, I've been in the Senate now for 3 years representing Manitoba. And before that, I had many years working in the cultural sector. I think my first job was working on Inuit work, actually, as a student at the Canadian Museum of History, and that goes back to Canada's centennial years. So I've been around culture and the arts for a very long time. And for many years, actually, I have had academic positions as well as museum directorships and have taught issues around Canadian cultural policy. And so I think this is a very timely discussion, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. So let's look at the history first. And in what ways has older federal cultural policies like the Massey Commission stood the test of time? And what should we continue to honor and preserve about our cultural policy history?
Well, let's start with the Massey Commission first. Let's break this down into its pieces. The Massey Commission was seminal in Canadian cultural policy. It was the first such commission. But I'm going to go back further than that. The Massey Commission was founded in 1949 and reported in 1951. Its impetus actually came from the Kingston Conference in 1941. Artist Andre Beeler, who taught at Queen's in 1940, had gone out to Banff, to go to the Banff Center, and there he met Canadian artists from different parts of the country whose work he didn't know. And he came back to Queen's and said to the principal that we don't know each other. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And they decided that Queen's University would host in 1941 what became the Kingston Conference. Artists, arts organizations, supporters of the arts came from all across the country. And let's go back in our history. By coming from, say, BC, they came by train. And so as the train came east to Kingston, people got on stations. And so we're discussing on their way to Kingston. There was, of course, no Canada Council. In 1941, there were no arts councils across the country yet. And what I find really interesting, the funding to get those artists from wherever they were came from the Carnegie Corporation in New York. Not the Carnegie Foundation, but the Carnegie Corporation. So I find that really interesting, that it was an American corporation that funded the gathering that got these artists and arts people, I should say, together. It was an electric time, and I have the original transcript in my own library. I have the original transcript of those 1941 meetings. What they came out with was a very real call to set up a Canadian agency like the Canada Council. They tried to meet with the Prime Minister of the day, who was not interested in meeting with them. So it took from 1941 and a number of repeated attempts to try to meet with the Prime Minister to get this message across that the arts are important. We need to get some meat and some life around them. And finally, the Massey Commission was founded in 1949. It was a commission of 3 people. And what really fascinates me by the Massey Commission, that in those 2 years, those 3 people traveled by train and met with people across the country. They received briefs. There were hundreds of them, hundreds of briefs. And they really looked at the sum total of arts and culture, which included scientific knowledge. It included the academic world of research. It included art making. It included playwrights. I have the table of contents in front of me. And it was divided in a number of sections. It was very well written and talked about international affairs. It talked about the artist and the writer. It talked about broadcasting, museums, libraries, voluntary societies, and on it went. And it took it was a very interesting brief, submitted and published in 1951. And you asked me what its lasting effects are or were. It called for the founding of the Canada Council for the Arts. They reported, the Massey Commission reported in 1951, and the Canada Council was founded in 1957. So it took a further 6 years. And so the Canada Council was founded 16 years after the Kingston Conference. And I happen to believe that the Kingston Conference is one of the most important cultural gatherings in the history of Canada. So the Canada Council, there were calls for the Canada Council to be founded subsequent to the Massey Commission. And what I find interesting there was it wasn't and it wasn't and it wasn't. And it wasn't until there was a private bequest that was used to initiate the original Canada Council. So the Canada Council was founded in 1957. Massey Commission was founded in 1949. The first Arts Council funding arts body in Canada was in Saskatchewan, and the Saskatchewan Arts Board was founded in 1948. So it's a really interesting mix of community grassroots, if I go back to my friend Andre Beeler, whom I knew, and we take a look at what came out of that Kingston Conference, and you'll know some of these names. Jack Shadbolt was the BC representative going forward out of the Kingston Conference, pushing for the Massey, what became the Massey Commission. Ernie Lindner out of Saskatchewan. I mean, they're really important Canadian artists who became at the forefront. And I think today we still have our artists who are the ones who are portraying and putting out there the societal issues that we as a society have to deal with. So there's a long introduction.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm certainly with you on acknowledging the community grassroots and artists and arts managers in dialogue. I think that that was very important to get things moving, and certainly something to honor and preserve moving forward. Now, even with all of that inquiry and that dialogue, inevitably things were excluded and weren't included. So in what ways has federal cultural policy excluded different themes, groups, or issues? And what now, in today's context, might we need to pay closer attention to?
You know, I'm not sure I want to talk about the details of exclusions. What I would like to say is that the history of Canadian cultural policy is like a roller coaster. There have been periods where the highs have been fantastic. And then there are periods where the support for culture, the understanding of culture, the lack of recognizing how important culture is to society and the country as a whole, it goes up and down in waves. And it goes up and down with every government in waves. Every government has been very supportive, and every government has been anything but supportive. So it goes up and down in waves, and I think we have to be honest about that. And there are times that, yes, one art form or one aspect of the arts may take ascendancy, and then there are times that another one might be. So there's a lot of Pollyanna in me. When you work in the arts, you work on hope because you really understand, I hope, the way our artists in all media look forward, right? They build on the past to take us forward. So they're the part of our sector, as well as scientific experimenters. They're the ones who build on what we know, build from today, and look to the future. And that's been an ebb and flow as well. So what happened in 1957 with the founding of the Canada Council were several other things, if I can sort of put this in a bigger context. The Canada Council allowed artists funding to be able to travel. So they got, like the 1941 conference, artists began to be able to travel across the country, see the work of other artists, hear the work of other artists, and get to know them. At the same time, air travel was coming in, and it wasn't as expensive. And so airlines, Air Canada, Trans-Canada Airlines, would allow artists, anybody, to stop over at no cost. So if artists from Vancouver Island was going to go to a conference in Halifax, I'll tell you, they stopped several times on the way and met artists on the way. So that brought a real connection that hadn't been there before of artists knowing each other. And at the same time, we're coming into Canada's centennial, where there was a great boost for who we are, and the arts got a huge boost. And then we get into the provincial centennials, and then we get into city centennials. So we went through a period where there was money, there was support, and the work that was done was amazing. And it was through those years with CARFAC, the Canadian Artists Representation Organization, that artists again began to get together. Filmmakers, musicians, Orchestras Canada, all that came out of those centennials. So I don't think we can point at any one thing. I think we have to understand that our cultural history, our cultural policy history is one of layers. And I like to do it as if we're looking at layers of, shall we say, mylar, right? See-through material with colors building on each other. It's almost like building a pyramid, never forgetting the base, but understanding that our governments and government policy is critically important for bringing these ideas forward.
Absolutely. And in being part of the mix, and the more and more I learn about my own history of cultural policy, the more I see all of these different trends and ebbs and flows. So the roller coaster certainly did resonate with me, and what I know, and I know there's much more to learn about cultural policy. So with that, and I think maybe, making that Mylar really colorful or learning to ride the roller coaster a little bit better, what are your hopes and dreams for the future of sharing of cultural policy information and research? What can we do moving forward together?
Well, I think, and that's a really, really good question. The federal government and the federal ministries, it can't be in one ministry, right? I think we have to understand that we work together, we work with the provinces, we work with individual artists, we work with arts organizations and the collectives across the country, because they all bring different perspectives. So going forward, my dream is to try to, I'm going to come to your exclusions, right? To try to repair the losses that the sectors had. And as you know, for instance, in the 1980s, we had the Applebaum Hebert Commission, which, like the Massey Commission, tried to look at the whole, but the whole of the creative and cultural world now is too big for one look. I think we have to be honest and take multiple looks and keep building it. And over the years, I've developed an octopus and looked at what are the key issues that contemporary society has to deal with, and how and where does our cultural sector fit. So for about 12 years, I was looking at statistical and anecdotal research that I did and that others have done, and shown how that none of our social issues, economic issues, international issues can be solved without the inclusion of the cultural sector. So my goal, when you say, what are my dreams are to take the arts out of their silos, take culture out of the silos that we put them in very conveniently, and poke holes in those silos. And I've invented a new word, which my family will be upset about, but as I keep doing this, I want us to de-silo the cultural world so that we really understand that that cultural sense of who we are is who we are. Our artists portray who we are as individuals, and I'm talking expansively. Artists, composers, musicians, visual artists, filmmakers, the whole 9 yards, right? They're able to show us who we are as individuals, as communities, as regions, as provinces, as a nation, and we have to listen, right? We have to listen. So one of my hopes is to de-silo us and realize that arts and culture are the 3rd largest employer in this country. That stuns people when I say that. Arts and culture is a huge contributor to the national GDP. People think arts and culture take. Arts and culture give back, right? They give back. They give back economically, they give back in terms of soul and understanding. Arts and culture are critical to health. We know that people who attend the live arts as audiences live 2 years longer, cost the health system less, get out of hospital a day or two early after surgery than others. We know people who attend arts and culture and are involved in arts and culture miss less work. We know they're more productive, so they're important in terms of, health and employment. We know our children learn through music and the visual arts. So why is it still like when I was at school, we got art on a Friday afternoon if we behaved all week, right? So instead of it being a reward, I think we have to understand that these 3 international languages of music, movement, and the visual arts are who we are. So going back to your question of looking forward, I want to de-silo that and bring us back to the center. Our Indigenous people, Inuit, all the First Nations, Métis, have centuries of rich, rich artistic traditions. We need to understand them as a whole. We need to understand those artistic traditions that our immigrant citizens have brought to Canada. A few years ago when I did the research, and it may not be current now, I guess I'm admitting that the last 2 years my head's been somewhere else, but for a while Canada was the only country that had as its citizenry people from every country in the world. Now think about that, what that does to our culture and understanding of who we are. So again, going forward, I'm really pleased with two reports that the Senate has brought out in the last year and last 6 months. One is the report of the Foreign Affairs and International Trade Committee that we did on cultural diplomacy, culture at the front of the stage of Canada's diplomacy. That will bring back the hollowed out part of the roller coaster, because we used to have a very vibrant international arts program, and that went. I hope we're now going to get that back, because cultural diplomacy is our voice internationally. It's soft power, if you like. And I was recently speaking in the UK and brought this up, and to tremendous response. The other support report is that on the Northern Lights, looking to the future of Canada, a wake-up call for the future of Canada. For years, our Inuit artists were the face of Canada. They were the most collected artists, Canadian artists, internationally. I hope that this report will repair that voice and bring it back. I believe it's the first Senate report to have reproductions of Canadian art as part of the report. And I think that's really important. We should be celebrating. So going forward, I want those celebrations. I think the foundations of the Massey Commission are still valid 70 years later. I think the interim reports, whether they're ones I worked on or whether they're not ones I worked on, there's very, very valid jumping off points that will help take us into a really rich future where we'll all understand each other better.
So I hear in part, of course, understanding our history, but this de-siloing or intersections that you're talking about, both for international cultural diplomacy, I heard health in there, immigration, I would add social development, seniors, yes, youth, labor, that there are all of these touch points. And even I'm hearing that multiple departments in the federal government are even going to Canadian heritage to ask, how can we collaborate? How can we work more with artists? And that's something that at least staff at the department hadn't seen previously in their years there. So in that shift, it almost seems like we need to celebrate and also get really good at advocating and sharing information around the strength of labor and health and all of these other octopus tendrils that you have alluded to.
It's really interesting. One of the exercises I used to give my graduate students, a discussion that we'd have, that I want you here, I'd give them a list of the then federal ministries. This is long before I was in the Senate, right? The federal ministries and the provincial ministries. And I said, now, as arts organizations or future arts leaders, whatever all, which of these ministries relate to the cultural sector? Well, they would all come back and say the Ministry of Heritage or Arts or Sport or whatever it was called in whichever level of government. And as we dissected it, I said, I'm going to argue that it's part of all of them. There isn't one ministry. You know, let's take the environment now. You know, who's been standing up for the environment really early on? And I go back to some of our artists, and let's take a look at Joan Cardinal Schubert, Indigenous artist from Alberta. Back in the 90s, she was doing amazing installation pieces that was bringing to light the issue of residential schools. When did we get the commission? How many years later? Faye Heavyshield, another Indigenous artist, was bringing work to the fore, which was addressing issues of murdered and missing women long before there was a commission. So I think it behooves us all to take a look at that work and carry on going forward by listening to what we see. The Royal Winnipeg Ballet has done amazing work with Indigenous communities. And I think it's really important to take a look at how these issues overlayer as we go forward.
Absolutely. That's a good call to action and a thing to keep in mind as the sector, increasingly thinks about data and evaluation, sharing the narrative, working with different groups, and working towards that spirit of collaboration and dialogue, which really does seem like it's shifting among the sector and others currently. Senator Bovey, we've covered a lot of ground in a short little while. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about the history of cultural policy or cultural policy information in general?
Well, there is actually, and you won't be surprised. I think we really need to take those looks forward, but those of us who have the honor and privilege of working as I do in the Senate, I believe I am the first art museum director and art historian ever to be in the Senate, so I take that very seriously. I'm working on developing a Canadian Cultural Bill of Rights, and I have been discussing this with various organizations across the country. I had committed to doing another sounding with the arts community in Manitoba in March. It's something that I started in my pre-Senate life, but didn't know where to take it because there wasn't the platform, and I'm going to contend now that as a parliamentarian, there is not only the platform, there's the responsibility. So I'm very hopeful that we can have some interesting discussions going forward on what a cultural bill of rights would look like for this country, for artists, for audiences, for seniors, for children, for immigrants, for multi-generational Canadians, for Indigenous peoples. And I pledge that this is really important for me going forward. And it pulls the whole art sector together in a new way, I think.
Senator Bovey, I'm really excited about that. And I have a quick side question on, I think, what originally inspired you to do the Bill of Rights, and is there anything similar internationally that you know of?
Good question. There have been some attempts internationally. I have not found a completed one. I have found drafts from other countries. I think at a academic conference about 10 years ago, I presented a preliminary draft. And I found it the other day, and it's not right. It's not right. It's not bad, but it's not right. There are some provincial ones and state ones, but you know what? I want Canada to be a leader. I got really concerned that I couldn't find a template. I thought, come on, we can be bigger than that. Our artists have led the way, right? And now that we're leading the way with cultural diplomacy again, that we're leading the way. I was up in Cape Dorset recently looking at the Cape Dorset Artists Studio. You know, we can do this. And you know, if we make mistakes along the way, that's all part of doing it, right? Not every work of art or not every book in its first draft or first iteration is its final self. So I'm quite prepared to, you know, we'll take our spills along the way, but we have such wonderful artists that I think we owe it to them, and we owe it to our audiences. And I'm going to go back years ago. I was in Durham in England, visiting family. And I was with the family. And we went into a lovely little bookstore. It was long and narrow, shelves everywhere. And the owner obviously had run this bookstore for years, and it was the epitome of what one would think of a bookstore. And in the middle, down the hall, were 3 big round tables. And I'm going back to this is in the 1990s. And on those tables, those 3 tables were all filled with Canadian books, Canadian authors. So yours truly said, "Oh, are you having a festival of Canadian writers?" And this man in his very gruff way said, "No, lady. Those tables are for the best writers of the world. Do you have a problem that they're Canadian?" And I said, "No, I'm thrilled." Now, isn't it interesting that in 2020, Canadian publishers are going to be the center of the Frankfurt Book Fair? So I rest my case. We've been on those 3 tables in many ways, many times. So let's get it out there and make sure we're there all the time.
I'm with you there, and I think that we can do it. And I have a lot of faith and respect for our sector and where we're going. So Senator Bovey, thank you so much for all of your work in the Senate, even prior to the Senate, and all of your thinking around cultural policy history and inspiring us to move forward. I feel really energized after our chat to get to work and have some conversations. Thank you again for taking the time. Very much appreciated.
Well, thank you, and we'll move forward together. And I just hope you know, and anybody who's seeing this interview, please, I'm always open to ideas, because we're only going to get there with honest conversations and pushing our boundaries.
Awesome. Thank you, Senator Bovey. All the
Thank
best for the rest of 2019 and onward to 2020 vision.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking your time to do this. I appreciate it.
To find out more about Senator Bovey and Tara Mazurk, check out massculture.ca. While you're there, join the growing MC network as a way of staying connected to cultural research. Goodbye.